Give me less than 10 minutes and I will show you how some of the world's best speeches start. Well, you have to treat the start of your speech like an attention-grabbing mechanism. After you start well, affinity builds and action happens. But if you can't grab attention, there will be no affinity and there will be no action. Therefore, attention becomes a really important thing to capture. Now, before even you go up on the stage, let's get some things very clear. Firstly, why are you up on the stage? Either because of a certain adversity and you've overcome that adversity, therefore you have become worthy of taking that space on the stage. Like Stella Young, who gave a talk at TEDx and she has overcome certain challenges, therefore she is TEDx worthy. Now let's look at another speaker like Sir Ken Robinson. One of the world's most watched TED Talk is given by him. Now he goes up on the stage not because he's overcome any adversity, but he has immense credibility. So he has done some great work which has given him a position in this world that actually commands that space on the stage and people want to hear him. So it's either adversity or credibility. So don't think that if you haven't had anything major happen in your life, you are not that stage worthy. You could have done some great work in a certain space and that's why you are stage worthy. Okay, so once that's in place, let's talk about the start of your speech. Now, I'm going to share a few examples with you. Number one, geography connection. How do you get up on the stage? And if you're speaking in a geography that you've never spoken at before, how do you connect with the audience? Now, I'm going to show you an example of one of my favorite speakers, Malcolm Gladwell, who goes to India for the very first time to speak. Let's see how he opens up his speech.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you heard, this is my first trip to India, but it's not my first experience with India. I grew up in Canada, and my father was, until very recently, a professor of civil engineering at the University of Waterloo. And from the time he arrived, he had an unbroken string of brilliant Indian graduate students, and they would show up every Friday and Saturday night unannounced right around dinner time and expect to be fed. And if you'd asked me as a child what Indian culture stood for, I would say a love of learning and the desire to be fed on every Friday and Saturday night by your professor.
Now, what's interesting about this is that he has used that opening to tell something his audience that is about them. He has labeled them as people who have absolute love for learning and love for being fed, which is so true to how Indians are. And that is a wonderful way to start. It connects you and your audience. You're not telling your own story, but you're telling a story about your audience. Everybody wants to listen about themselves, and this is a fabulous way to start. What do you know about your audience that you can convert into a story? He did exactly the same thing when he went to Dubai to speak. When he starts, he says, "This morning, when I was coming to this venue to speak, I told the taxi driver where I wanted to go. The taxi driver said, I have been to that place many times before and there is no such building there." And he says, "Well, this is the address that has been given to me." So the taxi driver says, "Okay, well, let's go and see." So the taxi driver starts driving and they arrive at the building, and then the taxi driver says to him, "I swear to God, a couple of months ago, this building didn't exist here." Now he says, isn't that such a Dubai thing? Things just come up overnight. And people from Dubai love that because it shows how quickly it progresses and the infrastructures get put in place and the efficiency, etc. So he does that repeatedly. Wherever he goes in a new place, he tells a story about the people of that country. Let's move to the next one. The next one, starting, that works really well is using self-deprecating humor, but in a way, through that story, building your own credibility also. So you have self-deprecating humor, but you also build your credibility through it. You're not telling a sob story about yourself. You're just having a laugh, but yet able to establish how amazing you are. Example, Elizabeth Gilbert. Let's have a look.
A few years ago, I was at JFK Airport, about to get on a flight, when I was approached by two women who I do not think would be insulted to hear themselves described as tiny, old, tough-talking Italian-American broads. The taller one, it's like up here, she comes marching up to me and she goes, "Honey, I gotta ask you something. You got something to do with that whole eat, pray, love thing that's been going on lately?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And she smacks her friend and she goes, "See, I told you, I said, that's that girl. That's that girl who wrote that book based on that movie." So that's who I am. And believe me, I'm extremely grateful to be that person, because that whole eat, pray, love thing was a huge break for me.
Now, of course, Elizabeth Gilbert is an author whose book, Eat, Pray, Love, became a movie and became so famous. So rather than getting up on the stage and saying, "I'm the author of Eat, Pray, Love," on which that movie is made, nothing would have been achieved by doing that. She tells this funny story from the airport, which is like self-deprecating, because those Italian women think that she wrote a book based on the movie, and that never happens. Everybody makes a movie on the book. So that's a great way to start. Another speaker who's done exactly the same thing in terms of establishing who she is with a self-deprecating humor is Dr. Brené Brown. Let's have a look as to how she did that.
So I'll start with this. A couple of years ago, an event planner called me because I was going to do a speaking event, and she called and she said, "I'm really struggling with how to write about you on the little flyer." And I thought, well, what's the struggle? And she said, "Well, I saw you speak, and I'm going to call you a researcher, I think, but I'm afraid if I call you a researcher, no one will come because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant." And I was like, okay. And she said, but the thing I liked about your talk is, you're a storyteller. So I think what I'll do is just call you a storyteller. And of course, the academic, insecure part of me was like, "You're going to call me a what?" And she said, "I'm going to call you a storyteller." And I was like, "Oh, why not Magic Pixie?" I was like, let me think about this for a second. And so I tried to call deep on my courage. And I thought, I am a storyteller. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collect stories. That's what I do. And maybe stories are just data with a soul, and maybe I'm just a storyteller. So I said, you know what? Why don't you just say I'm a researcher storyteller?
Okay, next. The next way to do an amazing opening is by doing a mystery start, by actually telling people things that they would wonder. For example, you can say, have you ever wondered why is it that the two cars that look the same, almost the same, VW Tourage from outside and Porsche Cayenne, they are actually the same, similar cars made in the same factory in China, very similar in how they look outside. One costs $36,000 and another costs $80,000. Why do people spend $80,000 on a car that is almost like a VW Tourage, right? Let's have a look at one example where the speaker has done that, the legendary Seth Godin.
By doing one thing, how an artist named Jeff Koons went from being a nobody to making a whole bunch of money and having a lot of impact, to how Frank Gehry redefined what it meant to be an architect. And one of my biggest failures as a marketer in the last few years, a record label I started that had a CD called Sauce.
So when you create mystery and people wonder, yeah, actually, why is that? Then you have grabbed their attention. I'm going to come to the very last way in which you can have an amazing opening for your talk. And this concept is called having an entrepreneurial passion, something that is deeply meaningful and profound for you. You have some kind of an emotional connection with that particular topic. This term, entrepreneurial passion, was first highlighted in a book called Talk Like TED by Kamene Gallo. Now, let's have a look at one example. Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, when she gave her talk, she starts with why she's so passionate about studying the human brain. Let's have a look.
I grew up to study the brain because I have a brother who has been diagnosed with a brain disorder, schizophrenia. And as a sister and later as a scientist, I wanted to understand why is it that I can take my dreams, I can connect them to my reality, and I can make my dreams come true. What is it about my brother's brain and his schizophrenia that he cannot connect his dreams to a common and shared reality, so they instead become delusion? So I dedicated my career to research into the severe mental illnesses, and I moved from my home state of Indiana to Boston, where I was working in the lab of Dr. Francine Bennis in the Harvard Department of Psychiatry.
Now, Dr. Jill Bolte-Taylor is, of course, a neuroanatomist and credible, but her deep passion to want to study brains comes from her brother. Her brother has issues or questions or problems, and she wants to find answers and challenges and solutions for that. If you use one of these few things, then you can have an amazing, amazing opening for your next speech. Stay storied, and I'll see you here very soon again.